Hi, we enter into Genesis 22 today, often known in English as the binding of Isaac, or in Hebrew for the word for binding, the Aqedah. If you haven't watched the introductory video, which I posted just before this one, I strongly encourage you to do so, because there I grapple with the legacy of the traditional interpretations both among Jews and Christians, as well as among philosophers, especially Kierkegaard, that we need to clear out of the way so that we can actually hear the story on its own terms, which is to say within the narrative context of the Abraham cycle in general, but also in the specific context of Genesis 20 to 22, as we've been going over, but also in the historical context of the likely situation out of which Genesis came, which is the post-exilic period when Persia took over the province of Yehud and demanded that the people that returned from exile obey the law of God and the law of the king. So much of what we're going to see here, as we've been seeing throughout these three chapters, 20 to 22, is how one of the themes in the background of these specific stories is monarchy and empire. Both the monarchy of the Israelites that led to exile, starting with Saul and David and going all the way through the books of Kings, but also foreign ones, whether the Babylonian or the Persian one that the audience was most likely under when the story was written. So we'll be looking at some of those subtexts, but those subtexts are often not noticed when someone reads this story simply as an ethical question of faith versus ethics. So again, if you're confused about that or interested, I encourage you to watch the introductory video, which I won't refer to again as we go through this passage. I started to say this test, but it is a test indeed. So part of what we need to look at are these parallels between our immediate passage and the call of Abram in chapter 12 and the sending out of Ishmael and Hagar in the previous chapter. So you can see on the right side of the screen some of the many parallels with 12:1 to 9, and very specific ones like the call Lech Lecha, which is only in those two places, and also to the land that I will show you, which is also unusual. The threefold you and your, from your land, your birthplace, and your father's house, your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac. A blessing at very similarly named places, Morah and Moriah, the building of an altar, and a blessing through Abram or later Abraham. So there's no question, almost all scholars agree that this provides a framework around the larger picture of Abraham's journey, starting in chapter 12 and ending here. But as I've been suggesting in the last videos on the Hagar and Ishmael story, there are many, many parallels between those two, and you can see those there on the bottom part of this page. I won't go over every one. I'll post this, of course, on the radicalbible.net webpage. But there are many, many parallels, and scholars again notice that. But that's also on Abraham's mind, certainly, that he's lost Ishmael, and now the question is, will he lose Isaac? Also in the background, although it doesn't have these immediate parallels here, is the situation with Abimelech. And one of the elements there with Abimelech was the question of practicing Hesed, which is not mentioned in our immediate passage. You can see it was in 21:23, and it's next in 24:12. But as God's attribute, here it's in red, and as between humans it's in blue. But I really want to focus, before we enter the story, on these three elements of this, because it's not present in our passage, but it is implied. So going back to chapter 19, this is Lot talking to the angels about having been shown great chesed, translated here as kindness, in saving my life, which indicates that the character of God there was to try to save the life of Lot and not have him destroyed, despite the fact that he offered his daughters, etc. Then, when we saw Abraham with Abimelech, we heard him say to Abimelech, this is what he had said to his wife Sarah that he should say, this is the chesed you must do me. At every place to which we come, save me, he is my brother. So Abraham there is having Sarah offer chesed, an element of what God offers, which is to say something like mercy or kindness as translated here. But then Abimelech says to Abraham, and translated, dealt loyally, and this is so important for our immediate seeing. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my son, or with my grandson, as I have dealt loyally, or I have given chesed to you, you will do also with me, and with the land where you have resided as an alien. So this echoes into our text here, because if we recall, and if you haven't watched these videos, I strongly encourage you to go back and watch this whole unit before we enter this story. What's often translated here as with my seed or my posterity generally means very specifically my son and my grandson. And as we've seen through these couple of chapters, in Abraham's question in mind, there still may be some question of whether Abimelech is referring here to Isaac or not. because Abraham didn't know what Abimelech and Sarah and God and the readers knew, which is that God protected Abimelech from going into Sarah and touching her. But Abraham is the only one that we know who doesn't know that. And Abimelech may well be taunting him here, referring to Isaac as his own son, to my son, which he's calling him to practice Hesed with. So if we hear that echoed with Lot, practicing Hesed would be to practice mercy, certainly not to offer him up for sacrifice. And I expect that readers are expected to hear this, that whether it's from the mouth of God or from the mouth of Abimelech, Hesed is what the people of God ought to practice because it's an attribute of God, as we've seen. That's something I want to be looking at here. Also, let's look at the shape of our story. And many scholars have noted that throughout this chapter there are many key words and many plays on words in Hebrew, which we'll look at as we go. But I've not found any who notice these couple of chiasms that then framed by the beginning and end, gathering and leaving. And I'll make it into one page so you can see the whole thing here. So we see these green lines connecting the opening scene that we'll look at today with Abraham rose early, and then later he returned to the young men and they arose. The young men are mentioned here and then mentioned there, but not mentioned in the story because they left them there. And then we will come back to you, and they returned. So this is not part of a chiasm, but is a framework into which there are these two embedded chiasms. And I hope it's not confusing to have the red line that connects these, but we see at the center of these little A, B, and A chiasms is the virtually identical key point: God will provide, as Elohim here and as Yahweh here. But the key is that God will provide. And I'm not sure why others have not noticed those chiasms, but there they are. And we'll see a number of key words we see here. Abraham is mentioned so many times in our immediate scene. We also hear your son, your only son, Isaac, repeated again and again, your son Isaac, your son Isaac. And of course we know he's not his only son, but we'll get to that in a minute. And the place, makom in Hebrew, which sometimes is referred is a word that refers to the temple in Jerusalem, like in Deuteronomy 16. Here's one example you can see. And so that's part of the tradition that led, as I showed in the last video, people to connect this via 2 Chronicles 3:1 and 2 Samuel 24:16 and following to this is the place, it is Mount Moriah, and the place where the Jerusalem temple was built, on the good deed, the mitzvah of Abraham. But that's a way of interpreting that we're not going to look at here, but that's one thing that connects us to place. So with this up there, let's enter into our passage. After these things, and as Westermann notes, even from a relatively earlier commentary, he says its function is always to insert a single event into a broader context. And that's certainly the first textual clue that we should look at this here. But we don't know how long it's been. And in the previous scene, we saw that Isaac had just been weaned recently when Abraham was forced by Sarah to send out Hagar and Ishmael, so he was only 3 years old. But the Midrash has many questions about how much time has passed here. As one note here says, it needs to be read against the entire Abraham story as its backdrop. But as Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg notes from the Talmudic tradition, after the words of Satan, pointing out to God that Abraham has grown rich without offering a single turtle dove to God, which suggests that he's being tested on whether he's sacrificing or not, and whether he should. The great medieval Jewish commentator Rashi argues that 12 years have passed and fills it in with Haggadah stories, but other Midrash argues that more time has passed, and that Isaac is now 37 based on the fact that Sarah was 99 when he was born, and should be named as 127 years at the death that immediately follows this. But that's all speculation, but it will matter for how we understand Isaac's role in this. Is he just a little child whose father is taking him on a mysterious journey that he can't possibly understand? Or is he a grown man with a very old father, over 100 years old? And if we understand him to be 37, well, Abraham is now 137, and certainly a 37-year-old man would be stronger than his 137-year-old father, wouldn't he? So we'll have to repeatedly look back at how we understand, or at least imagine, Isaac and Abraham's age and maturity relationship as we go through this story. So after these things, God tested Abraham. And the Hebrew has ha Elohim for the God, but the verb is singular here for tested. So it's not like we looked at when Abraham said to Abimelech with plural verbs to go with ha Elohim that could be translated, the gods led me to wander. This is certainly suggesting the one God, the only God, but it's in singular. And then tested Abraham. The word Nisa is only here in Genesis with God as a subject, but let's look at testing in the Hebrew Bible. And I won't go over all of these, but I've put up almost every single use. And the word has a double meaning in a certain way. It can mean testing. It has a root that can also mean exaltation, or from the root nes, meaning an ensign flying aloft. So as the rabbinical midrash notes, hence to be tested successfully is to be exalted, to be raised up. And that certainly corresponds with the traditional understanding of Abraham passes the test and is exalted by God, and it leads to the temple, etc. But we don't have to go that way. What's important here is, what is this test? And if we look at the red ones on this page on the right side, God testing humans, there's two elements of this. The Exodus is certainly a key place of it, and the Exodus story as a written text is almost certainly older than Genesis. And so the Genesis audience would know this. They were put to the test to do two things: to listen carefully to the voice of Yahweh and to do what is right in God's sight. And we see that all the way through this. I will test them whether they will follow my instructions or not, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether or not you would keep the commandments. And so notice it's not just a matter of what Christians might think of faith as something you just have, but what's in your heart so that you do what God wants. And if you're a Christian reading this, that's of course consistent with Jesus' constant word, those who hear the word of God and do it. So this, I'm not going to get into the Catholic versus Protestant Reformation arguments about faith versus works, because the Bible really knows nothing about that except in the very late text, like the argument between Paul and James implicitly, but certainly not in the context of Genesis. All the Torah texts, whether they're from the Deuteronomistic historian, like Deuteronomy, or from other authors, understand that the purpose of this relationship is that people do what God wants them to do, not just that they have something like faith in the abstract. To be a people who follows God's ways as a witness to the other nations, as we hear in the prophets. So it's not surprising here at this testing to see whether people will do God's will, and we see that over and over again here. So in Deuteronomy, using the Deuteronomic phrase from the Shema from chapter 6, whether you will love Yahweh your God with all your heart and being, but it's still about doing. So we see in Judges, which is part of the Deuteronomistic history, whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of Yahweh as their ancestors did. And similarly in the Psalms, which are certainly from different sources, test my heart and mind that I walk in faithfulness to you. And this one is actually wrong. They put God to in the desert to the test. And then this one from 2 Chronicles about Hezekiah, testing to know what was in his heart. So the question of what's in one's heart as a matter of what one does, and that's what's at issue here. But it's not just an abstraction. I want to make that very clear from the beginning. Many scholars think of this as an abstraction, and even Richard Middleton, whose book I mentioned last time, and he goes into great depth, sees this as a test whether Abraham understands God's character. And that's certainly a part of it, whether Abraham understands God as merciful. But it's not just so Abraham has a right idea of God in his head. It's so that he makes the choice of how to live and what he will pass on to his descendants. So there is a way that's being established. It's not the monarchy. It's not what I call in my work the religion of empire, but the religion of creation, where God's image is in everyone and not just in the king who rules over. So that's part of the test here, and it flows out of the covenant that Abraham made with Abimelech, which even the Midrash recognizes inappropriate because the only covenant partner should be God. So given those things, this is a test of whether Abraham has really learned what he's supposed to be learning about what it means to love God over all, including his son. So God says to him, Abraham. Notice that didn't happen in chapter 12. In the Septuagint, it has the doubled Abraham, Abraham, which we'll hear in verse 7. But here it's just the first time. And this is the only time that Elohim calls Abraham by name. It's otherwise Yahweh. And he said, here I am. Hineni, which is rare as a complete response rather than introduction or exclamation within a larger statement. But as my note below here has from JL, and I'm sorry if I'm not remembering who that is, I'll put it up on the screen, there is no good English equivalent for the Hebrew Hineni. Translated in this verse as here I am. The term indicates readiness, alertness, attentiveness, receptivity, and responsiveness to instructions. It serves as a kind of refrain throughout the Aqedah. Abraham employs it in answer to God here, to Isaac in verse 7, where it is rendered as yes, and to the angel of the Lord in verse 11. So his presence ready, here I am. And here's what we hear. And as Phyllis Tribble said a half a century ago now, it moves from the generic term of kinship, your son, through the exclusivity of relationship, your only one, through the intimacy of bonding whom you love, to climax in the name that fulfills promise, the name of laughter and joy, the name Yitzhak. But she discovered that in the 70s, but the Midrash had this long before. So let's look at this little scene from the ancient Midrash, which imagines this conversation between God and Abraham. Please take your son. But I have 2 sons, Abraham said. Which should I take? Your only one, God answered. But each of them is the only one of his mother, said Abraham. Whom you love, God answered. But I love them both, Abraham said. I am referring to Isaac, God replied. Each of those elements to highlight which one. And yet, we need to still look more closely. So take, the verb quak includes na, which is please. And which indicates this is a voluntary act, as many commentators have noted. As Wenham has below, the use of the enclitic n there, please, is rare in a divine command and makes it more like an entreaty, another hint that the Lord appreciates the costliness of what he is asking. And as Sarna adds, Abraham has absolute freedom of choice. Should he refuse, he would not incur any guilt. So he can choose whether he's going to do it or not. And your son, your only son, and what do we make about that? He's not his only son. And Abraham may well believe that Ishmael is dead, and that may be the case, but God knows that Ishmael is still alive. It was God's work that allowed Hagar to see the well and to save them and to promise blessing and prosperity for Ishmael as well in the future. So what is going on here with God referring to Isaac as his only son? Maybe there's a translation element here. As Kant says, not the philosopher, the modern scholar, if we translate as your only one, we not only further lower the value of Ishmael, but virtually nullify him out of existence. And yet that is what the Hebrew word means here. It means only or solitary. Your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And now we see this is the first time that the Hebrew word have for love is mentioned in Genesis. The first time right here. So we need to look at that a little bit too. And here's a little chart of love in Genesis. And as a number of scholars have noted, I think I have the note down here below, it tends to signal trouble whenever it occurs in Genesis, with the exception of 2467. It signals some sort of favoritism, that from Middleton. And we say that exactly right here. So this is the one exception where Isaac took Rebekah and she became his wife and he loved her. But we see here the 2 parents, Rebekah and Isaac, are split over which of their sons they love. And then here's Isaac asking for the savory food that he loves, which will set up the trick as to who gets the blessing. Jacob loves Rachel, which sets up the rivalry between her and Leah, and we see that there. And then in a horrible scene that begins with rape and then calls for marriage, Shechem loved Dinah. And then Jacob, as Israel, loved Joseph more, and that creates rivalry among the children. So what we see as love is often here expressed as a question of favoritism. And certainly the use of food here, which is not about love in the New Testament sense of agape, of offering yourself for others, is simply about one's preference or favoritism. And so this seems to suggest that Isaac is the one he loves, but we also notice that when Sarah said to send out Ishmael and the slave woman, it was powerfully evil in Abraham's eyes. It didn't say that he loved Ishmael, but certainly that expression that it was powerfully evil to send him out suggests something like love. And have we known that he loves Isaac or prefers Isaac? Certainly not like the rivalry between Jacob and Esau or between Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah. So we really don't know anything about that, but here it is in the divine voice, and so we have to accept it as true. And go to the land of Moriah. And the Velek Lakah here is exact match from 12:1. Get up and go, the Vav just being and the Lek Lakah, only in those 2 places. To the land of Moriah here, an unknown place, and as I've noted, linked in 2 Chronicles with Mount Moriah. It's also linked in the Song of Songs for the Hebrew word mor, which means myrrh, and but we don't need to go down that road. And now here's a key word that's often missed, but both the Midrash and modern scholars have noted it. The word for offer here, baha'alilu, who means basically to ascend or to go up or to take him up, leading to some Midrash to say that Abraham misunderstood. He was supposed to take Isaac to the mountain, not make him the sacrifice. And jumping down here, Kant notes the same thing, that Olah means to bring up, as it's expressed in Ezekiel 40:26 about ascending stairs. And Rashi had noted it as well. And so is the test that God gave him a word that's ambiguous to see which of those interpretations that Abraham would pick. Did he hear this as offer him up or take him up? And we don't know yet. If we didn't know the end of the story, we wouldn't know exactly what was going to happen almost all the way through it. So that creates another layer of suspense when most scholars assume that we already know that Abraham plans to offer him as a sacrifice. And of course we do find that out later when he ties him up and holds the knife over him. But we don't know it yet, do we? So right from the beginning we have to recognize that he has a choice to make. And offer him as a burnt offering, an olah. We only saw it one other time in Genesis, and it's not in Genesis. Genesis is not about offering burnt offerings, although Abraham, when he was Abram, was told to offer animals in chapter 15 in the dark in that mysterious scene, but they weren't described with this word. Offered on one of the mountains, and it's interesting to know which mountains, that I shall show you, which echoes the original call to the place that I shall show you, as we saw in the parallels here. So the I shall show you is connected to places we'll see, and we see in the very next verse, he said it and went to the place. So I'm not surprised that this has already gone long enough to make a full video. I was hoping to go 5 verses, but I won't push it any farther. We'll stop now, and we'll pick up with verse 3 next time. See you then. Bye-bye.